Hi Varsha. Hi Zane.
Hi, Frank.
Hi, Frank.
I'm really happy to have you both on the podcast today because we're here to talk about the Hague Group, which was announced, launched. I think it was January 31st, which is like sort of ten days ago, and we are going through a moment in history that is very dark, pretty scary. I'm talking about Trump, Musk, but also the sort of rise of fascism pretty much all over in Europe, including in Belgium, by the way. And people tend to feel paralyzed in these moments, and that's what we don't need. And an organization like an initiative like the Hague Group is so important to show people that if we unite and if we work together, we can actually we are more and we are more powerful than the sort of the 1%. So I wanted to start with you, Varsha. You are the general coordinator of the Progressive International, which is the convener of the Hague Group, of which you're also the acting chair. Before I start, I wanted if you can remind us briefly what is the Progressive International.
So thanks, Frank, and thanks for having me and Zane on today to talk about the Hague Group. The Progressive International is really an attempt at answering the question of what internationalism looks like in the 21st century. We recognize that we're no longer in the heyday of internationalism of decades past, but surely today more than ever before, the kind of evils of globalization and the interconnectedness and the attacks of our world being together have only consolidated, whereas on the other side, progressive forces have become more and more fragmented, despite winning victories and battles in our own territories and jurisdictions. So Progressive International is about 5 years old now. We launched in May 2020 at another moment where once again we thought the world would unite against a crisis, which of course we all know as the COVID pandemic and the virus that we thought of as us waging a war against it together. So PI is an international of progressive political parties, of social movements, of trade unions, and really intellectuals and think tanks all coming together to organize, mobilize, and unite and act as one group.
Thanks, Varsha. So I just said that you like Progressive International was one of the convener of the Hague Group. How did the idea come about to actually do the Hague Group and this initiative?
Yeah, it's funny. We've been asked this question a lot over the last 10 days, as you can imagine. And the honest answer is that the Hague Group kind of should not have been formed, right? A group like the Hague Group would need to be formed only in a world where the international order has been decimated and destroyed to such a large extent that despite rulings from, a court like the International Court of Justice well over 8 months ago, ruling that the Israeli occupation of Palestine is blatantly illegal and setting out very specific legal obligations for every state to undertake to stop the genocide and to end the Israeli occupation, we barely see any movement in the world. Again, the Hague Group only needs to be formed in a situation where the International Criminal Court, once again, one of our premier global institutions of justice, issues arrest warrants against the two leaders responsible for the last 15 months of genocide against the Palestinian people. We have seen the evidence of which live streamed to our phones. And then in response, we see states brazenly defying the orders of the court or openly challenging the jurisdiction of the court. And this not just from some of the usual suspects, but from countries in Europe like France, who have spent the last couple of decades championing themselves as, as the leaders of universalism and human rights and Western values, so to speak, so on and so forth. So it's in that context of real threat to international law and any semblance of it that the Hague Group had to be formed to say, no, actually, we as the tricontinental bloc of 9 nations from Africa, Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean will not only salvage international law, but also actively put up a defense to the attacks on them.
Thanks, Varsha. Zane, I'm going to come to you. You are the Director General of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa. You were like one of the key driver of South Africa legal action at the International Court of Justice against Israel. Varsha just talked about the sort of rules-based order, international order, that people like Trump, Musk, and others are trying to, and obviously Netanyahu and Gallant are trying to dismantle right now. Dismantle the institutions that are supposed to, empower the rule of law. What you did with South Africa, you're still doing it, of course. I want to remind people that the case against Israel at the ICJ is ongoing. It's going to probably take a few years before it reach a conclusion. But why it is important for you, for South Africa, to be part of such a group, of the Hague Group?
Thanks, Frank, and also good to have you bringing both Varsha and myself onto your platform. Frank, I think it was last year, January, just soon after I think they had the first provisional orders where we had the first discussion. I think then already, we were discussing the almost cheekiness of South Africa bringing a Western power into the ICJ for the crime of crimes, which is genocide. I think the term then, and we used it again in the Hague Group, was international law subalterns taking the space in an institution that many felt was designed to only hold them accountable, not for them to use the platform to hold others accountable. What we've seen since then is more countries joining the case, some from the north, some from the south, but in total, it will be 11 countries, as Namibia is now finalizing their own intention to join the case. And what we're also finding is that in this era where middle powers and countries from the south are beginning to look at these institutions that were seen previously as part of the empire and the institutions to defend empire, are perhaps the vehicles that we don't have massive economic power, we don't have armies to shape the world in the manner that we would like to, have to use values and the principles of international law while we transform it, to use them to hold the most powerful accountable. And in this case, it's Israel for the crime of genocide in the International Court of Justice, but it's also the individual criminal liability that the International Criminal Court has also stepped in, and the warrants of arrests. And we see the reactions is firstly for some states to go over jurisdictional issues in the International Criminal Court that they knew were dealt with many years ago. And then also to try and use exceptional clauses in their domestic legislation to duck the compliance with the arrest warrant issues. So it's important for us to come together with, in the first case, other countries from the south, many of them who have all joined the case of South Africa versus Israel at the ICJ, but they've also taken up matters at the ICC, to come together to hold not only ourselves accountable for obligations, but to hold others accountable for their obligations as well. We feel that this kind of approach, and we have to really be thankful for the PI for initiating this, will allow us, together with others, to strengthen a process towards a just international order, not a rules-based international order that's skewed towards holding some accountable while others enjoy exceptionalism. But I think it lays the basis for genuine action, for collective action in The Hague and other spaces, to use international law while we transform some of its tenets to hold those most powerful accountable. And I think that, hopefully some countries from the West will now join us. Hopefully, countries who've joined the case but have not yet joined the collective action will come together, because we do see the attacks. We see the attacks are deliberate. We see prominent politicians from the US saying that the very same rules-based international order, and that term itself is skewed, that they set up, is now superfluous. They don't need it anymore because it can now be used against them. We need to use it, transform it, and help to build a more just international order from that basis. So for us, that's why the initiative was a no-brainer.
Do you see the Hague Group acting as some kind also of, like, in a way, counterpower to US hegemony? I'm asking you to, you can answer, Varsha, if you want, or Zane. Yeah. Oh. No, you go, Zane.
No. For us, it's not just about hegemony. It's about those who want to instrumentalize, the institutions to advance a particular set of ideas. And we see what has happened in the last 2 weeks is a reinforcing of notions of who's civilized and who's uncivilized. We see a leading power like the US using what can only be described as systemic racism to devalue some and to value others. So while at the same time, you're looking at blocking and deporting black and brown people from the US, but now making space for rather privileged groups, as our minister said, from South Africa to get fast track to refugee status, and that can only be described as systemic racism at play in the international space. And we see this is the way that they seek to engage in the institutions of global governance. And for us, this group is about ensuring that the institutions of global governance are there for all to use equitably. Yeah.
Varsha, feel free to add anything. Yeah. You muted, Varsha.
Apologies, Frank. Yeah, at the moment, certainly, I think it is acting as a counterpower, if nothing else, by President Trump's responses, right? So if you look, not even well before the formation of the Hague Group, every single time that any government has tried to hold the United States to the same international legal standards that it then uses against everybody else, or European nations against everyone else, the response has been one of pure punishment. You look at Spain saying they're not going to let their ports be used to transfer arms and ammunition to be used against the Palestinian people. And the US government responds by a foreign trade investigation, which could levy up to millions of dollars of fines per $2.7 or $2.3 million of fines per voyage on the Spanish government. If you look at what happened with South Africa after it brought its Genocide Convention case back last year, the US House of Representatives responded by introducing legislation to put all bilateral relations with South Africa on review. And now once again, you're seeing that same logic really of punishment come into being yet again after the Hague Group formation and the now recent executive orders from Trump, and of course sanctions against the ICC, so on and so forth. So one is, of course, we need to act in a united fashion because the other side is actually completely united, the US and Israel and its backers in Europe. Every single time there has been any response, any call within a multilateral institution for some curtailment of Israel's violations of international law, the US has responded with further funding. European nations have responded with further arms transfers. So there is already a reactionary international that exists and that is acting together. And in response, we do need a united front. But the attempt is not at all to stay in the margins. If you look at history and how the apartheid regime in South Africa fell, of course, a lot of that was also led by global South states. You look at the, Lusaka Manifesto of '69. You look at the World Conference Against Apartheid in Geneva a decade later. You look at the conference in Delhi, in fact, in my city in India, 5 years after that really brought together nations of the global South to ask for the fall of the apartheid regime. That was extremely key. But eventually, it did lead to, in fact, the Nordic countries responding with some of the strongest sanctions against the apartheid regime. It led to UN Security Council issuing the arms embargo that really broke the back of the apartheid regime in South Africa. So for us, while one reading of it is of us acting on the outside, the attempt very much, though, is to shake really these international institutions that have now become captive to singular powers, to unilateral power from the United States, and have them once again actually be global in nature and act for the rights of peoples all over the world.
I'm going to stay with you, Varsha. So it's amazing, obviously, that the Hague Group has been created, but how is it going to work? We know, I mean, I know that coordinating initiatives is probably the hardest job in the world. So how are you going to coordinate this, and what kind of, in a way, actions can we expect from the Hague Group?
Sure. I think one thing that's quite remarkable about these countries that have formed the Hague Group now is that they've already subjected themselves to broad public accountability, both with the domestic public as well as with the international public. For instance, if you look at the September UN resolution that was adopted in the General Assembly by a majority of nations, over 129, the list of state legal obligations supposed to be undertaken by states is really large, right? Include much more than the 3 measures that we've adopted now. What these 9 nations have done is brought themselves out of the halls of the United Nations and in the public political sphere committed to attempt to do everything within their governments to uphold these 3 measures. And of course, our hope would be to move beyond the 3 measures committed to now until again, we do materially cut off the arteries of the genocidal machine in Israel. So one bit of it is accountability for the members of the Hague Group. The second is, of course, expansion. We have, very happy to report, and I think Zane can add a bit more to this as well, that the last 10 days have been really reaffirming when you look at the responses from multiple governments, both from the global south, from the global north, from the Arab world, who have responded positively to the Hague Group and said, yes, we also would like to be able to make the same commitments at the national level, because it is clear now to everyone involved that making pleas that we know the United States will not respond to, making demands of the Israeli government that we know they will not commit to, is pointless 15 months into the genocide. We need protagonism, no more pleading. And so to see that kind of protagonism now in response to the Hague Group from multiple countries around the world is exciting. So we hope to be able to expand that. And the third, of course, the key point that you've mentioned is on coordination. And I've been making this argument for a while, and a lot of the civil society organizations and trade unions that have been working on ports, for instance, do know this quite well, that it's quite difficult. I can't name names here, but in quite a few of the countries that we've worked with, we know that even when there is political appetite, that governments themselves sometimes struggle to be able to discern the deception from the Israeli Defense Forces. When ships come wearing different disguises, when military equipment is listed as civil equipment, and especially blatant misuse of dual-use items, which are, of course, mainly used against the Palestinian people as military equipment, but are on all vessels and ports being listed as civilian equipment instead. So coordination across these ports, across all of our networks, which really Israel's ships are using our lands and our ports to transfer these weapons, becomes extremely key. And we hope to be able to make that coordination and the kind of due diligence infrastructure more sophisticated as the group grows.
Zane, I'm going to come to you. I mean, obviously, feel free to add anything, but I was wondering also, while Varsha was talking, we've got a body, an institution called the United Nations, but we've seen over the last 16 months how totally undemocratic not the United Nations is, but especially the United Nations Security Council, which means that you've got, the vast majority of the countries saying stop the genocide, end the massacre, and you just need one country, and in this case it's the US over and over again, for total inaction, which is, I mean, you could explain it to a kid and he'll say it doesn't make any sense, but that's the way the UN so far works. So in a way, I see also the Hague Group as something saying we countries are going to take actions, without having to face a potential veto from the superpowers. I was wondering what you think about that, and also if you want to add anything that Varsha said.
Yeah, so I think this comes to the heart of it. I mean, these institutions, for the ICJ, for example, stems from the UN Charter, and all members of the UN Charter, which means all member states of the UN, are part of the ICJ and are bound by by its rulings, especially those that are binding, such as the provisional orders coming from contested applications like ours. So they are bound by it. But we also see then, firstly, an attempt to reinterpret it, to move away from the binding nature of it, or just to completely ignore it. The ICC is a slightly different creature. It's a creature of it's a treaty-based institution, but again, it's a treaty-based institution that countries use their sovereign power to join. And some of the enforcement mechanisms of the ICC then rests also with the Security Council, unfortunately. So you have the Security Council, where you have, three of the P5 members, one not state parties, but have the power to defer situations to the ICC, from the ICC, or to refer them to the ICC, but don't feel themselves accountable to what emerges from there. And I think what this group is doing is changing the discussion a bit, because it's talking about how do we strengthen the institutions, how do we build respect for these institutions that have been instrumentalized in the past. So it's turning them upside down, but at the same time pointing to the deficiencies within the Security Council itself. So aside from Security Council reform and the vexed issues of membership and the veto power, it also raises the question, can you be a member of the Security Council if you are not party to key treaties, such as the Rome Statute? In some cases, even some of the optional protocols are linked to the International Bill of Rights, including, in some instances, the Conventions of the Right of the Child. All of these kind of key instruments, you should not be a member of the Security Council on any basis, never mind a permanent basis with the right to veto, if you are a country that hasn't signed up to these critical institutions, treaties. So this is now part of the discussion happening, and we hope that it will be part of what we put on the agenda when we talk about refreshing the General Assembly, for example. How do we make sure that the General Assembly, which is a lot more democratic, gets more powers, moving away from an advisory body to a body that can actually become a lot more enforcing of the will of the majority of member states. So there is a significant discussion that stems from these kinds of initiatives. So the Hague Group is in the first instance concerned with protecting what we have, because what we have is under attack. I think Varsha used the term, what was obvious before is no longer obvious. And we need to protect what we have, but then also work towards strengthening what we have. And holding Israel to accountable after 5 decades of systemic impunity is an important initiative for the Hague Group. But it's focused on this current situation, but it also brings to the fore the broader issue of how do we shape these institutions to work for all, including the UN.
Yeah, again, listening to you, it's sort of the UN and the way the US and Western Europe talks about it reminds me of democracy in general, right? It's like this veneer of democracy. Look, you can vote, you can, as long as you do what we tell you to do. Once you go the wrong way, and nothing applies anymore. So if you vote for the wrong person, we'll do a coup and we'll take him out. If you actually put ourselves in the dock, we'll say these institutions are rubbish. We're going to dismantle them. So it's also, I think the last 16, 17 months, if people didn't know already, have been a moment of extreme clarity, right, in regard to the world we're actually living in. We're about to finish. Varsha, I wanted to, leave you the last words, and maybe if you have anything else to add, but also, what do you see as the next steps of the Hague Group?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. And I completely agree with you. I do think we're seeing a kind of the last stage of the mask-off empire phenomenon. Of course, many of us have been saying this for years, but now it seems that we have Donald Trump and Elon Musk doing the job for the left, where they are more than anyone else, making it extremely clear exactly what US foreign policy has always been about. But unlike even, of early 2000s, the real disguise and veneer of, as you say, bringing some kind of civilization to the rest of the world, and this burden of democracy promotion has been completely dropped. And again, as someone who's been trying to do this for years, I can't help but feel grateful for this moment of clarity that is coming from the US chattering with its own hands, its own propaganda machine that has been built up over the last many, many decades. And for me, both from the Hague Group as well as from the rest of the work from the Progressive International, we look to Europe to see what decision it makes. We really are at a turning point in history now where, for me, the North Atlantic Alliance has never looked more fragile. And I think it's going to be extremely difficult for them to keep talking the talk without walking the walk, as we've seen Europe do for the last 15 months of the genocide, with its partner becoming a brazen, unreliable President Trump operating from the White House. So if, as they make this choice, the call from me would be for them to join on the right side of history to the Hague Group, not just committing to these 3 inaugural measures to hold Israel and implicitly its backer, the United States, accountable, but go beyond this to, as Zane said, strengthen our international institutions and stop having them be so skewed in power, where a single veto, either within the United Nations or a brazen defiance in the case of, say, the ICC or the ICJ, leads to zero consequences.
Thank you both. I know you're both extremely busy. So again, I wanted to reiterate how much I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. And obviously, good luck, if it's luck you need, with the Hague Group and everything else. I mean, there's so much to do, So thank you again.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you, Frank. Bye-bye.
Bye.